Hello, and welcome to The Great Debate. My name is Dr. Deborah Maurer of the Department of Philosophy and Religion here at the University of Mississippi. So, for those of you who have not joined us in the past for The Great Debate, this is a campus event that we typically hold live and in person for our campus community, and it is held each year as part of what our department calls the Dialogue Initiative series. And as part of the Dialogue Initiative, we try to run events which increase the way in which individuals can engage with each other to help them foster skills of talking and engaging in discussion, to understand more about views that they hold, which are their own, or views that are different from those that they themselves believe. So, our goal behind the Dialogue Initiative series is to examine some of the most contentious questions in society facing us today, some of the most thorniest and most ethically pressing questions, and to look at them and examine them in a way which is civil, where we can consider the arguments on both sides, making use of and marshaling the best evidence, positions, interpretations, claims, and concepts to try to come to some resolution in the case, or if not that, at least greater understanding of both positions on both sides. So, with that in mind, I hope that you enjoy this evening's event, which is the University of Mississippi Ethics Bowl team presenting debates on two cases. Now, as I mentioned, this is typically an in person event. We are conducting it virtually via Zoom this year, and we have guest judges and guest commenting team. So it is a little more informal than it normally would be for an in-person event where we have panelists up at a table in front of a large lecture hall. But I hope that you enjoy the event and find it informative and interesting. A couple of quick things to keep in mind before you watch this event is that these are students who are simply at the beginning points of learning details about these cases. They have additional research to do, additional arguments to make, and they are composing these arguments on the fly. So the students do not know the questions for the debate. They are given the questions at the beginning of the round, no differently than you, the viewer, will see the questions. And you have also had an opportunity to read the attached cases. So they compose an argument in mere minutes, only knowing the case, having read them, but not knowing the question and not knowing how they're going to argue it. So I hope that you are first suitably impressed at the quick thinking nature of these students and their ability to craft an argument out of thin air. The second point I want to note, these are not representative of their personal views. These are simply arguments or claims that they are presenting as a way to help us understand how we could approach or think about or dissect conceptually some of the arguments within the case. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. I know most all of you know me already. I'm Dr. Maurer in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. And today we're going to be debating cases 5 and 7. And we have two distinguished guest judges with us. So the first is Dr. Tim Yenter, who's an associate professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy. And he is also the director of the interdisciplinary minor in cinema. And then we have Andy Harper, who is the director of the Southern Documentary Project and also an instructional assistant professor in Southern Studies and also in journalism. And for our guest commenting team or opposing team, we have two illustrious members of our Department of Philosophy. So Ethan Davis is a former graduate student and has his master's degree in philosophy, specialized in ethics and political philosophy. And Joe Duda, also Joe, give a wave, is also a former member of our department with a master's in philosophy, specializing in ethics. And so these two folks have generously agreed to come back and donate their time. Joe Duda was an assistant coach for the team while he was here, as was Ethan Davis. And Ethan Davis was also a former member of the team. So I know they're going to put the team through some good paces this evening. And then Ali Cotter. Ali, give a wave. Ali Cotter is a current member of our graduate program specializing in ethics, and she was also a former member of the team. And so she's going to be working as a guest judge tonight as well. What ethical principles, if any, should guide hobbyists and historians' sense of living duty? Okay, so I'll repeat that to you again. So, what ethical principles, if any, should guide hobbyists and historians' sense of duty of living history? So, with that presented, I'll go ahead and put you all in your separate breakout rooms. The team, your time will begin 30 seconds after you all get into those rooms. All right, everyone, welcome back. So the University of Mississippi Ethics Bowl team has 10 minutes to present their initial arguments. Your time begins now.
Well, first of all, we'd like to thank everyone for being here to listen and have this open discussion with us about living history and about what ethical guiding principles we, the presenting team, believe should guide both hobbyists and historians' duty of living history. So we think that Ross is going to give some good principles that are going to help to guide how both historians and hobbyists should act. So Jacob is going to talk a little bit about what those different things look like, including non-maleficence, fidelity, and self-improvement. Along the way, we're going to make a slightly separate, or we're going to make a distinction between historians and hobbyists, because we think that there are probably different responsibilities there. And then finally, we're going to respond to a potential objection that might come up in the present context. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jacob to talk a little bit about why we chose the principles that we did.
All right, thank you. A big part of the reason why we stuck with Ross overall is that it allows for like flex for different perspectives and different situations in ways that other ethical theories are a little bit more rigid and a little bit more tight. Particularly, we think that like Rossian deontology is like that's what it's like so appealing to it as opposed to like traditional Kantian deontology, where a lot of the time, where under Rossian deontology, what you do is you look at any given situation and then you see like what prima facie ethical duties are jumping out for that situation. How do they play together? And then like what rankings do you have for them? And that within this question, we see not only do we have like different prima facie duties that pop up, but you also have two different distinct like groups that pop up with this where they have different interests. So with the historians, we think that they really only have one prima facie duty within this, which is the idea of fidelity, which is presenting things as they are true and as they are accurate. Where like what the main goal of a historian is to document what has happened, document it accurately, and then present it accurately to other people. We think that that's pretty simple, and we think that's pretty self-explanatory because that's just the job of historians generally. And then we think that hobbyists, they within this question is like mostly reenactors, and that within that you get a different list of prima facie duties where you actually have more than one. Where in this case you have three. So that like, and the most important one for the these hobbyists is that of non-maleficence, particularly on the idea of doing no harm, which will be covered a bit more later. Then second is the idea of self-improvement, where like you have this big factor of experiential learning, and then you have this idea of fidelity that comes last. And to get through this like ranking, like why we ranked it like that, we think that self-improvement comes above fidelity because like even though yes, the truth value is very important for these reenactors, we think that the idea of the actual learning and the education for themselves is actually a lot more significant in this case, which is why that comes more. And then we think that non-maleficence is more important than self-improvement for these reenactors, is that they need to still be mindful of the potential offense that it can have to people and the context that they are acting in, and the fact that, and they have this duty to do no harm, but we don't necessarily think that they have this duty to prevent harm. And from that, we think that that covers our explanation of Ross pretty well, and I'll hand it back to Juan Ramon.
Thanks, Jacob. So yeah, I'm about to hand it over to Weston, who's going to talk specifically about like the implied context of non-maleficence as it relates to living history. Weston?
Yeah, so we'd like to take a certain point here and to say that non-maleficence can be understood in two different modes. One of them is to do no harm, in which someone does not actively cause harm to another individual, and the other is prevention of harm, whereas to say like a police officer is there to prevent harm between two parties. And we think that the primary facet of non-maleficence that we're focused on here is do no harm. And the way that we think that that's important is that the present context of historical ideals can be traumatic for certain people. Now, if anybody is having trouble understanding me, please just wave at me real quick because I'm seeing a little sketchiness on my camera. But for example, a Dixie flag in your own home doesn't really harm anyone, mainly because nobody's seeing it, but also because that's your own personal views and people have an ability to respect that. But a Dixie flag hanging out in front of a state capitol does a certain amount of communication where context brings in a relevant harm that someone who is of African American descent, somebody whose ancestors were oppressed by that particular iconography, it can cause racially based trauma that we need to focus in on and say that's harm that we don't think that people should do. And even if you're not a Civil War reenactor, say you are an African American activist who wants to extol the terrors of racism, then there are programs of experiential learning, of living history, where people have reenacted slave auctions and it has caused severe harm. We've even seen this in high school classrooms where people are asked to portray slaves. And we say, well, that's obviously not the right thing that you want to be doing, no matter what the educational outcomes are, because it's not going to, you're going to miss the point. You're going to cause too much harm to these people because they're experiencing racially based trauma if they're reenacting African American slavery in the United States. And that's why we think, even though fidelity is incredibly important in living history, it's something that you should strive for. It's not at the expense of the people participating. It's not at the expense of the present harms that are given to those people. And so on the application of non-maleficence and its relation to fidelity, that's our view on it and how context is incredibly important when you're talking about these values and what you should be upholding first. And that's it if someone else would like to take over.
Yeah, thanks, Weston. I think I'm going to turn it over to someone to talk quickly about why we do still think that fidelity matters, why keeping true to what happened historically is something that is additionally important. Ryan, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this. So I just want to draw an important, this is a very topical issue right now. Basically all these statues that are you'll see protests around them, or you'll see petitions to take them down, et cetera. Especially Confederate statues within the South. And so I want to bring an example from my hometown of Franklin, Tennessee. So we have a statue called Chip. And so Chip was erected during Jim Crow era, specifically to keep Black individuals out of the town, to let people know that it was still a South sympathizer. And so this is one of the main reasons that we think that fidelity is such a big issue, is because this statue was never part of history. It was born out of hate. It was contextualized out of hate. Now, if you go right down the street, there's a carton plantation, and that has now turned into a museum where people can go and learn about the Battle of Franklin, and they can learn about the Civil War and about the slaves that lived in that plantation. And so this is where the big divide comes in between fidelity, where we really want to draw the line, is because one of these symbols is truthful to the time. One of these symbols provides factual information for people who want to learn about the history of the United States, the history of the Civil War, the history of Jim Crow, and the history of slavery. And the other was born simply out of hate and maleficence to do harm onto other people. This is where we're really going to draw the line in between reenactments, is where we believe that the guiding principles should be only to show what has occurred without a bias influence. And so I think we're going to draw the line right there on where we think fidelity is with these reenactments. I'm going to hand it back over to Juan to transfer us off to our objection.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we think that it's really important that, especially as a historian, you are, staying faithful to what actually occurred, so you do not enable willful misremembering or willful ignorance of what actually occurred, because that enables harm to occur in the future. But I think I'm going to hand it over to Jacob to talk a little bit about a potential objection that we still don't prioritize non-maleficence potentially enough.
So we think that a very like real potential objection is that like we are not giving like enough priority to non-maleficence, and that like that these actors have a duty to like not only like not do harm but to also prevent harm. And we don't think that this necessarily is the case, because these reenactors didn't actually contribute themselves to any of the harms that we are currently seeing right now, that like are currently being protested against and all of that. But the thing is that they do have a duty to not do harm, because like it is very bad for them to create harm that previously did not exist. So we think that like putting the duty to like for these actors to like prevent harm is putting a burden on them that like they don't actually have.
Thanks, Jacob. So today we've talked to you a little bit about why we believe that you should first not do harm if you're a hobbyist or a historian, and why, especially if you're a historian, why fidelity to history is something that is so important. And we've talked about why it can stand up to some potential objections, the system of principles that we have set up. We are very proud to present, and we look forward to what the commenting team has. Thank you so much for having us. With that, we yield our time.
Okay, good. That was a 5-second yielding of time. Okay, so now the commenting team is going to have 3 minutes to work on developing their case. Your time will begin 30 seconds after you get into your breakout rooms. Our commenting team will have 5 minutes to develop their response, and your time begins now.
Thank you for that great presentation. Thanks for having us here. Good to be here. So we just want to raise a couple of objections. First is it wasn't super clear what the distinction between historians and hobbyists actually are. What kind of distinguishes a historian from a hobbyist, and how do you account for potential overlap where somebody is both a historian and a hobbyist, and how their duties rank in situations like that. I also think that one of the big issues, at least for me, was this idea of objective history presenting. I think academic history and history as a practice and field in general, it has lots of argumentation in it. It's more normative than you're presenting it as, and I think it's might be very difficult to remove bias from that. So I'm not sure that your virtue of, or your duty of fidelity can actually be upheld. And that brings me to my last big problem, which is I think you might have an ought implies can problem, where you're asking a bunch of historians to do something that they actually can't reasonably do. And with that, I'd like to pass on the torch to Eden here.
Thank you, Joe. And so the first thing I want to do is really stress the point that Joe made about a historian versus a hobbyist. It's not just that distinction is a bit unclear, but I think it's important to address that one person may be both a historian and a hobbyist. So at the very least, there's some overlap here that might present some conflict of duties as you've laid them out. And so if you could address that, that would be fantastic. Another thing that I'm interested in hearing about, or that we as a commenting team are interested in hearing about, is it sounds like you might be using some utilitarian calculus to talk about what harm is, even if you're not meaning to do so. So some of the examples that you give when you're talking about non-maleficence involve weighing the harm you might do against some other good. So the slave auction reenactment that you mentioned, you said the educational component that you get from that is totally outweighed by the detriments of the harm that stems from that. So the question becomes, how does that relate to duty? Are you using a utilitarian calculus in here and just calling it a duty? So that would be something that we would like to be cleared up. And then finally, I would like to hear more about, or at least know how your duty distinctions or your duties that you've presented apply from monuments to reenactments, because you used this and you seem to think it was a good analogy that they track. But one of those, the monument, is not an event. It's something that is diachronic in a way that an event is not. So I wonder how these same duties, right? So you mentioned the statue is in offense of all of these duties because it's not it doesn't exhibit fidelity to history. But it seems like a statue as a monument should be considered differently than a reenactment, which is an event. And so I would like you to see if that distinction bears any merit for you, and if you think that it's changes your principles at all. And so finally, I just want to give you a quick summary of what we talked about. We asked you to think about an objective view of history, question what it is to have history, right? We want you to address that because it will flesh out this idea of fidelity. It will help us understand what it means to be a historian, etc. There's an ought implies can problem here, right? Can historians even do what you want them to? What is a historian versus a hobbyist? Can they be the same person? Does that create conflicts of duties? Are you using utilitarian calculus, subtly under the radar and disguising it as non-maleficence? And finally, does the distinction of an event such as this track well with your analogy of monuments? So with that, Dr. Maurer, unless Joe chimes in, I believe we cede our time.
We cede our time, yeah.
Joe is nodding, so we officially cede your time. Thank you. So University of Mississippi Ethics Bowl team, you have 3 minutes to work on developing your response. Your time will begin 30 seconds after you're in your breakout rooms. All right. So University of Mississippi team, you've got 3 minutes to work on developing your response. Excuse me, 5 minutes to present your response. Your time begins now.
We'd like to thank the commenting team for raising a few interesting questions, and we hope over the next 5 minutes we'll be able to clarify what we meant and show why the guiding principles that we mentioned in our presentation will still be what we would like to talk about. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Weston to talk about the distinction and clarification between historian and hobbyist.
Yeah, so this is something that we wrongly assumed was a little bit more obvious than it was. When we're talking about historians in the context of living history, we're talking about the people, as the case points out, that are consulted for these reenactments or whatever event is going on, the people that have a PhD or a master's in history, whatever their academic certification is. And to that degree, as they're consulted on these events, they should, as accurately as possible, represent events, life, culture of the time that they're focusing on. And then we acknowledge that there are people with PhDs in history, that interest in history then motivates them to become hobbyists. And so when they make that switch from being consulted on the event themselves to actually participating, that's when they should switch to that those other guiding principles of non-maleficence being first as hobbyists. We hope that that clarifies our distinction a little bit more and acknowledges that there's overlap between those two groups.
Right. And so it's whatever profession you're acting in. If you're acting in the profession of a historian, that's what it ought to be. Thanks, Weston. Jacob's going to respond to the impossible problem now that was mentioned.
So when you talked about how history cannot be objective, we think that this is very true. And we think that this is specifically a reason why we think that fidelity is a prima facie duty, where this duty is something that is continuous to these people that are acting as a part of this profession, where it's not just as simple as publishing the book that has all of the facts and then you're done and over with. Your duty as a historian is fulfilled, because it's not as simple as that. Sometimes our understanding of history changes over time. So it is the duty of these historians to get as close to that as possible and to work eliminating that bias in whatever ways they can. And we think that this is something that is quite well solved by a lot of academia that is around today, by things such as limitation sections on research papers that highlight, hey, here's what this paper, what we think we're doing good at covering, here's what we know we're not doing so good at covering. And we think the same is very much true for history as well, where it is a duty to be as close to that actual facts that happened in the past as possible, even though we know we can't actually get completely all the way there. We hope that addresses your concern on that aspect.
Yeah, and I think, Jacob, you were also going to talk a little bit about how we can still talk about consequences, even if we're not going for a utilitarian framework.
Yes, so we did. So Rossian deontology is a non-consequentialist framework. What this means is that we can consider consequences, but it is not going to be the sole deciding factor, and that the primary motivators behind what we're doing as our decision making and what we determine is right or wrong is going to be things that are not entirely based on the real world and the consequences of what happens. And we also think that in terms of the scope of everything, the what we consider for non-maleficence is just like not on the same scale at all as what you would be doing for a utilitarian calculus for calculating utility. So we think that both because like we are able to actually consider consequences, even though it's not the sole deciding factor, and because just like the scale and difference of calculating utility versus non-maleficence, that's like why we think that like non-consequentialist, like Rossian deontology is still the preferable framework here.
Thanks, Jacob. And finally, I'm going to talk briefly about the statue point that was brought up, that this isn't really an event, and perhaps the commenting team didn't understand how that fit into our framework. We think that, first of all, both the erection of a historical statue as well as taking it down is something that has to do with living history, and it is a living recognition of certain historical things. And moreover, we think that just the statue staying up itself is kind of like a continuous event. And with that, we think it's really important with our applied ethics that we talked about earlier about like where this is being put up and the manner in which it is. So if it is a historian who is like leading the charge, they should be prioritizing, being truthful with what they do, as well as also not causing harm. So not putting up things of living history, whether that, whatever that might be, in places where people might be trying to vote, and actively working against being an oppressive force. So what we've talked about today is we've talked a little bit about recently the distinction between the historian and the hobbyist, how the impossible problem, you should still strive to have a duty to the truth. And finally, we've talked a little bit about how we can still talk about consequences.
And that is time. Thank you. So judges, you have up to 15 minutes to ask your questions, and you also have 3 minutes to deliberate and think about what you'd like your question to be and to maybe prioritize those questions. So your 3-minute prep time will begin after you all get into your breakout rooms. Okay, so judges, you have 15 minutes to grill the team. And remember, the more powerful your questions are for them, the better you make this team in preparation for competition. So grill them to the point of getting them close to tears, but maybe not actual tears. So here's the rules for judges. You get 1 question and then 1 follow-up question, and then we'll move on to the next judge. So anyone, feel free to start.
So I'll start, and there'll be no tears. We've got enough of that this week. We don't need additional ones potentially. I'm going to ask a question that's kind of a fundamental question about your premise when it comes to historians. I think y'all are really struggling with what to do with historian here. You're assuming that professional historians are part of this process, and it's my experience that that's not actually the case most of the time. Most reenactors are not working with professional historians, academic historians, to work them through how to do these reenactments. And sometimes it kind of goes the other way. So my question to you is, it's a comment about your approach, in that I think you have to rethink about the question about how historians are actually involved in this stuff. Is that a question? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you for your question. And so I think we approach this kind of as if we were either a historian or a hobbyist, and we try to provide like the guiding principles if the historian were to be involved in this process, what ought they do. But I think that there's also still, even when the historian is not present in this process, there is still that duty of fidelity that's tagged on there as a guiding principle for just the hobbyists, but that it's just probably a little bit less important than it might be for someone who is an active historian, because of the platform in which they speak doesn't carry the same weight in as to like the future of how we understand our past. And so hopefully that kind of begins to answer your question, but I definitely appreciate hearing about that.
And then further to expand on that just a little bit, we think that the fidelity does matter for these like reenactors and hobbyists as well. But just to like make it extra clear, it is like the least important duty we see for these hobbyists and these reenactors, because as like was just mentioned previously, like the primary like objective of these reenactors is not to actually educate anyone, but to the more so like about the actual history, but to kind of have this like hands-on like experiential learning about how everything happened, how it all works together, and like why this stuff was significant, not necessarily like what actual like nitty-gritty details of each situation were like true or false or like actually happened or didn't happen.
Professor Harper, are you satisfied with that answer?
I am. The only question that I have, and this may be a process question that just explains my ignorance, but when it became clear early on this was going to be there was going to be a distinction between historian and hobbyist, I would expect maybe more kind of a research or a deep dive into what historians actually do or don't do with these kinds of things, and also whether or not the reenactors themselves are actually care if they're true to you, if their fidelity. For some of these folks, it's just kind of a lark as well, and so I think some research maybe would have turned that up, but if that's appropriate.
Yeah, just to hit on that last point about the hobbyists potentially being untrue to people that come as spectators, that is part of the reason that we think fidelity should weigh into this. There are other duties that you could put under Ross, like justice and reparation and respect for autonomy, and we didn't get time to really go into those. But fidelity it's implied that it's above those things, and so we're not downplaying fidelity for hobbyists so much as we're saying that non-maleficence is definitely more important for them. Whereas a historian has a different professional perspective. Their fidelity does take a higher role. But we acknowledge that many of these reenactors are not upholding their duty to fidelity. So we would agree with that point for sure.
And I think an example of that perhaps is, when a reenactor who is just a hobbyist, they're taking the hit, they're dying in the middle of a war reenactment, we probably think it's okay for them to kind of scooch over into the shade. Like, we don't think that if you're actually that reenactor, it matters so much that you're laying on your back, face exposed to the sun. Maybe it's okay to like do an extra rollover or get into the shade. So that's what we mean in aspects of, for them, their self-improvement is a little bit more important. That doesn't mean we support them blatantly rewriting the history books.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, Judge.
So y'all did a good job identifying the principles, but I am not sure exactly how you're applying the whole policy. So could you explain what the specific harms are besides like not telling the truth, for example, and how you can specifically go about not causing harm in this situation?
Yeah, I could take that. So in the interest of fidelity, say you have a Civil War reenactment where slaves were used as some sort of, trench diggers or just cannon fodder, whatever. I'm not specifically versed on, Napoleonic tactics, but there were undoubtedly some really terrific situations that African Americans in American history experienced during the Civil War. And the reason that we think non-maleficence is really important in those is because it's not a good idea to start inviting people of color to these things and say, yeah, we're going to have you reenact victimization roles, and we're not going to take any account for how that could affect you negatively after the fact, because it was what actually happened. And so that's the sort of context that we were trying to put it in, is that there are some terribly oppressive things that have happened in history. And when you're looking at history, you want to ascend as much as possible to fidelity, but not at the cost of participants in the actual event. And so that's if that kind of helps highlight what we're talking about. Because, for example, if you really wanted to do the full context of the Civil War, you would include some horrific slave auctions in those reenactments, not necessarily the battle themselves, but in the little shanty towns they set up, as part of the whole culture of the South for reenactments down here. That would be contextually appropriate to include the horrors of slavery, and we don't think that it is ethically appropriate, however.
And then we think that it also has like further implications between like the relations that these like reenactors and like hobbyists themselves have with the communities that they participate in, where if there is like a community that just takes particular offense to this Civil War type stuff happening, and where like the community that is where this like event would be hosted at views it as just like offensive and like rubbing the face in the history of like and just all of that, in the same way that you can have similar to statues. And that's not necessarily like a place where these like hobbyists should necessarily like participate in, because that's not actually being productive or beneficial or like generating any actual education or like any like ties to fidelity or self-improvement at all for anyone involved.
And just the final thing to tag on to that is that time and place matter when it comes to non-maleficence, right? Like it might be okay to dress as even a Confederate soldier and engage in this, but to do so and then reenact a parade, say in front of the courthouse on election day, is something that could cause like active harm and should be like avoided if possible.
Okay. Allie, are you satisfied with those answers?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Next judge.
Sorry. So one of the oldest standing philosophical positions is that the imitation of vicious people is bad for character. And I don't think you've addressed this at all. You've tended to treat it, except for these cases of going in front of the courthouse or going fully contextual where you add in these additional things, just stick to the strict on the battlefield reenact of it. You're assuming that it's morally neutral, and maybe not even morally neutral, but a kind of self-improvement through experiential learning. But isn't the imitation of vicious people itself vicious? And it's actually character destructive, not character building. So isn't, acting as a soldier invested in the cause of maintaining the institution of slavery, right? What the Mississippi Secession Declaration called the greatest material interest of the world. Isn't that itself a vicious practice? And you've treated it as morally neutral that even has some benefits, but I'm not convinced. So I'm not convinced you've gotten to the real heart of the issue. So my question is, isn't it wrong to enact these things? And this compounds the historian. I don't think you've gotten to the real problem for the historian either, because the historian isn't going to get involved in this vicious practice, because this goes against the very educational model that they are trying to do. And then it's further compounded by the epistemic failures that Professor Harper was bringing to light, which is that in many cases, these are, guys who have these self-published books and they think they're getting the history right and they're getting it wrong. And they're just engaged in these viciously circular practices that are reinforcing not only the false history, but also their just basic engagement with the imitation of the vicious person is itself a vicious practice. So that's my question. Why I think it's neutral.
So we think that like the concern you've highlighted is specifically why we put self-improvement above fidelity, because we think that like even though like yes, these reenactments do have this educational value, it's only certain parts of these reenactments that have these educational value. As Weston was talking about previously, if you invite like Black people to these reenactments and you only actually make them like reenact the like specific like awful and gruesome roles that slaves had at the time, that is like just vicious. That doesn't actually serve to help anyone. That doesn't serve to educate anyone. That doesn't actually serve any like ethical like purpose there, other than just to like be vicious to people. Which is like there's a really like important highlight as to why we think that the self-improvement comes above fidelity, because like if you stick too close to the fidelity, then you are reenacting those vicious aspects. You are reenacting those bad aspects, and you are not actually like taking it, like actually giving, you are not actually allowing opportunity for the self-improvement to take place. You're only allowing for the vicious aspects of this to take place when you are like being too accurate as a reenactor.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
go for it, Weston.
Well, I just wanted to point out, and this is going to appear a little bit like I'm backing away from the argument, but the question did ask living history in general, and I think that if it had been specifically on the Civil War, I would have probably leaned more towards your character virtue argument. But we have to acknowledge that there are people that are doing, you know, the Pensic Wars of Ren Fair included in this living history, which is a broad term. And so we needed to kind of be able to step back and say, well, if someone wanted to do the Revolutionary War, we think non-maleficence is important for them as much as somebody who wants to do the Civil War. And so I think that there's, you know, you brought up some really, really important points about the viciousness and moral exemplar being, or following the wrong moral exemplar here, that we would agree if we were running a virtue argument point. But then we would also hit you back with something like, well, there are certain militaristic virtues that they're upholding. But that's a separate point. The question, as we tried to answer it, was to include people that would be enacting all sorts of living history, not just the most vicious aspects of it.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to, you know, at the risk of being naive, slightly disagree with like this as a necessary condition, right? That portraying vicious people necessitates you becoming a more vicious person. And you know, maybe a childish example, but you know, like Johnny Depp playing Jack Sparrow, I don't think necessarily made him a bad person, even though like pirates engage in like a variety of absolutely, you know, terrible behavior similar to that of people in the Confederacy by upholding slavery, by stealing and, you know, killing lots of people. So I think that there is some room for displacement, you know, some cognitive dissonance there. And we think though, and that's why we also do have self-improvement there. If you begin to get so in depth into these roles, perhaps it is time to step away. You know, that would be under our guiding principle for these hobbyists, an excuse to not go and not participate in a weekend of this if you do see yourself kind of falling down that road. And so while that might not be necessarily like the most solvent thing, we think that if you are this hobbyist, these are pretty good guiding principles to go along. But thank you for your question.
If I could follow up, I guess I don't see the guidance for deciding whether or not this reenactment is a permissible one or not. So there was a suggestion that some of these don't involve wars, and then a suggestion that some of these wars might in fact be just wars. But of course, in order for there to be a reenactment, you would have to reenact both sides. So even if you thought there were just wars, and even if you thought those just wars were worth reenacting as a part of living history, you would have to reenact both sides. So I guess I don't yet see what the guidance is that is supposed to help us decide which kinds of activities we're allowed to engage in and who we're allowed to be in these and what, therefore, well, I'll just stop it there.
So we think that a lot of the distinction with that is that like these reenactors and hobbyists don't necessarily have the same mindset that historians do, where for a lot of them, it's not about like, oh, which side am I on, but it's like, oh, I get to like make this nice costume. I get to like create all of these like nice, like period correct tools and equipment and things like that. So there's a lot of these like other like things that are like completely disconnected from like the specific war that was happening, but there are these like actual like craftsman like skills that are involved that like a lot of these people are specifically valuing, and just they happen to be reenacting along the side. And that may be a bit of a narrow example, but even in like the if like you are like one of the bad guys in one of these wars, that doesn't necessarily mean that like you were supporting them. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are like giving them like your like moral sign of approval. It just means that you are assuming that role for the purpose of something that is explicitly not actually real, for something that is not actually like upholding the values and like the time, place, and such of everything, which is like again further like reemphasizing why we think that non-maleficence needs to account for the time, place, and like circumstances and general context of when something is happening.
Right, and that's why like the manner in which you're playing the role might even matter more than what role you decide is acceptable. If you're going to engage in malicious behavior to go to that extent to try and reenact a certain role, then that should probably be avoided. But if you're able to pull a Johnny Depp and kind of, interact in a slightly different way as that role, there's probably a way in which you can engage in either side of one of these conflicts.
Okay, good.
In other words, no matter how probable it is that someone on the Confederate side in a Civil War reenactment definitely said the N-word, that does not make it permissible for you to do under the guise of fidelity. You're still going to say that would be wrong, no matter. And we think that approach is what you're talking about.
Okay, we're going to officially end our round there. And so we'll stop the recording. We'll take a few minutes for the judges to give feedback to the team on how to develop their case more for the competition. And so we will go ahead and break into our separate rooms for your prep on case 10. Your time will begin 30 seconds after you all get into those rooms. Welcome back for case 10. So University of Mississippi Ethics Bowl team, you have 10 minutes to present your argument and your time begins now.
We think that because you as a viewer have the right, by the time the dramatic introduction music to a documentary is beginning, to know what the tone of the documentary is going to be, that we think the foremost guiding principle should be appropriately setting the audience expectations. So what we're going to do for you today is we're going to talk a little bit of the context, both historical and present, of documentary making. What have been the historical trends? What do these artistic choices actually look like? Then Jacob's going to talk a little bit about setting audience expectations appropriately, whether it is for educational purposes or whatever else it might be. And then we're going to show a few applications of that, and we're going to end by a potential objection. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Weston to talk about the context.
Okay, so we should acknowledge, and I'm sure that one of our judges is going to have a field day with our very short and simple explanation of the history of documentary filmmaking. We should acknowledge that documentaries are in a very unique position as far as artistic cinema go, because while documentary filmmakers do consider themselves artists, they have a certain duty to the truth whenever they present their art at the end of it. And to exemplify that, we can show some trends that have happened. So there was a poetic trend, or maybe more accurately, I should say that Paul Grierson identified 6 major trends in his book, The Principles of Documentary. And a few of the major ones are poetic trends, which focus on formalistic ways of presenting aesthetic messages to convey truth to the audience. Then there's an observationalist trend, which was a documentary film that we might normally think of in schools, where it's just a bunch of slideshow pictures and somebody very dull and just speaking over and telling you factually the events of something as it went on. A participatory documentary, where you get more into documentary filmmakers actually participating in the creation of truth, where you can see them as interviewers and they might stoke for certain questions. This is something closer to what we think of as generally in journalism. And one of the most recent forms is reflexive documentary filmmaking, where as part of the documentary, as part of the way that it lets you in on the construction of truth, it shows how it made specific artistic choices in cutting it. We can see something like that happening in take Tiger King, for example, when it introduces Doc Antle. It shows him saying, hey, I'm going to walk around to the front of my house and open the door like an episode of Cribs, and then you guys come in. And then they chose to include him saying that, and then to include him actually doing it. So you're aware that he is helping to construct the artistic presentation of truth within the documentary. And so we think that reflexive idea is really important when we're talking about what an artistic vision for a documentary filmmaker is going to be.
Yeah, so thanks, Weston. And we think that, that is why the ethical principle guiding documentary filmmakers is to set expectations appropriately, so that there can still be a diversity of documentaries, but that they are still able to kind of be there to the truth. But I'm going to hand it over to Jacob to talk a little bit more about that.
So we came to this conclusion of audience expectations needing to be set appropriately through a veil of ignorance social contract approach. And we came to this approach because like we understand that like there is actual like artistic value that is beyond that of just the presentation of fact, that is beyond that of just like something like journalistic within a documentary filmmaking, because after all it is being published as a documentary rather than as some like newspaper publication that makes it like different and more artistically significant in those ways. But that we think that the audience expectations, both in terms of like how it is edited and how the truth is presented, is very important. And we think that like for a couple of examples of like something that we think does good, Keeping Up with the Kardashians and Ken Burns, we think both do like a fantastic job. And we think that like Tiger King is like pretty much the worst example that we can think of, and that the case does like a pretty decent job of explaining that. And then we use the veil of ignorance in this because both from the approach of like, if you are just like a documentary filmmaker, you don't want to be like associated with other documentary filmmakers that are like kind of making the name of documentaries like worse and bad by like messing with audience expectations. And then like as a viewer or someone else that's like not actually a documentary filmmaker, you want the documentaries that are being produced to be good. You want them to be worth watching. You want them to be like worth actually like taking into account and looking at. So that we think that like the way that you set audience expectations appropriately is by making it so that like the editing that is happening and the like presentation of truth that is happening is upfront and honest. So that way, whenever like if it is like something that is valuing entertainment more, then it needs to be clear that it's valuing entertainment more. If it is something that is valuing like the facts and the actual education more, then it needs to be clear about that that is explicitly what it is doing.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And so I think again, you can kind of see through the advertising as well as the platform in which these different, documentaries are presented. It's pretty clear when you're about to watch a Keeping Up with the Kardashians that you're not really in it to necessarily learn a lot of educational material that you might find in a textbook, but that at its heart, documentary making requires artistic decisions. You can't just show, all of the film that you have showing literally everything that's ever happened. But I think at this time, Ryan is going to go over a potential objection for people who might be more Puritan documentary filmmakers.
Yeah, so thank you, JR. Thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to touch on that being on documentaries being an artistic media. So for the potential objection that documentaries only have the duty to report the truth and nothing but the truth, I think that this is we as a team believe that this is just not nuanced, is not a nuanced enough approach to like look at documentaries, because documentaries inherently are an artistic media, because if you just take a camera and shoot something, that is, I mean, you're doing art. So with any type of art that you are pursuing, there's going to be some level of bias within that art. Even if it's a documentary where you're filming animals, you're disturbing the animals in the woods in their natural habitat unless you get it 100% perfect. So there's going to be some level of bias any which way you go with documentaries. And so we as a team believe that because of this, you have to set the expectations of the audience to what degree that bias will be a part of the documentary. How much will the director, the producer, the whoever's shooting the film, we need to know to what degree should we be expecting for there to be bias within this documentary leaning towards one side or the other. Because even if you're documenting the Syrian refugee crisis, there's going to be a bias one way or the other, and audience expectations needs to be set accordingly to that.
And then I want to further expand upon Ryan's point by like highlighting what Tiger King gets so wrong, where initially it was envisioned as this like presentation of information as this like somewhat journalistic approach, so that like it says like that it is fact, it acts like it is fact, but like in reality, like the editing that it does take and the way that it treats truth are not actually like respectful to either the truth or towards the audience's expectations, because it's acting like this informative thing when in reality it is geared more as this entertainment piece that's not actually educational, not actually doing a whole lot of informing of people.
Yeah, Weston, were you about to say something? Okay, no, okay. Yeah, and I think that that's something that's so important because you're breaking the social contract when you present your thing, whether it be a piece of reality television or whether it be a piece of documentary filmmaking, and you're breaking your contract when you don't fulfill that. Yeah, Weston, real quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have a lot of talk about what is true and what isn't true, and one of the things specifically on the mentioned Tiger King case that we did disagree with is they didn't do a good enough job of representing the subjects that are in there as unreliable when in fact they are. For example, all of the lies that were told by Joe Exotic at the expense of Carol Baskin, at the expense of its viewers, there was an opportunity, a clear opportunity to refute a lot of those lies and present a truthful depiction of Joe Exotic as an unreliable narrator. And we think that that was a failure. And they had all the opportunity. They showed that they had the ability to use that creative treatment of reality, and they didn't do it for what we would consider a representation of the truth there.
Thanks, Weston. And so we've talked about how there are many different categories of documentaries that exist and should exist. But the one guiding principle that we should all look for is to set audience expectations accurately. This allows the viewers to better engage in the film, and it allows you, the filmmaker, better to get your message across to the people you would like to. Proud to present. Thank you.
Okay, and that is time. So opposing team, you have 3 minutes to work on developing your response. Your time begins 30 seconds after you all get into your own respective breakout rooms. Okay, and we have our opposing team back. So opposing team, you have 5 minutes to develop your comments and your arguments. Your time begins now.
Team, thank you so much for your presentation. We are excited to give commentary on this. So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to pass it off to Joe to raise some other objections. But my first question is your guiding principle that we have to set up the right expectations seems to overlook a massive, massive feature of learning, namely that we learn oftentimes best or most profoundly when our expectations are upset in some way. So this has physiological roots. I mean, dopamine is released when our expectations are upset. Dopamine is the learning chemical. It's the chemical that tells us to pay attention to something. And this is part of the way we learn things. So right away, what your principle rules out, at least as it's set forward, is the most useful way that humans learn things. You've deprived a documentary filmmaker of one of the best ways to express a particular point to people, namely by upsetting an expectation. And this happens to us all the time. We pay attention more when our expectations are set. So is there any wiggle room in this? Do you mean setting up proper expectations overall, or expectations in a certain way? Namely, you're saying that we will approach this medium in a certain way, right? And so I would also like to know the method by which that's going to happen. And Joe's going to talk about that a little bit later. And then also, it seems to me that the criteria you laid out for pegging a documentary will apply equally well to journalism. Journalists have artistic devices at their disposal. They have style, they have tone, they have word choice, they have sentence structure, they have all of these things they can muster to the cause of communicating a specific story. And we expect them to do it truthfully, really every time. And if they're not doing that, then we don't really even call them journalists anymore. So if that's the case, do we have to change our ideas about journalism, or do we have to change our ideas about documentaries? Because like I said, everything that you laid out seems to apply equally well to journalism. And we expect journalists to not give us entertainment value. We expect entertainment writers to do that, right? Or opinion pieces to do that. We expect journalists to be doing something different. So I will now pass it off to Joe.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, so my just big question is this. It seems like you admitted that documentaries are a form of art, and your theory is that you're operating off a social contract theory. And I'm just wondering, in what circumstances do I agree with the society I partake in that art has an obligation to tell me the truth? And I'm not certain what that truth would look like. So it's unclear to me why I have to think that any documentary series is obligated to tell me the objective truth when it could be telling me something like somebody else's truth. That the Tiger King does this, it showed me what Joey Exotic's truth was, and that could be a delusion, but it's true to him. Similarly, there have been recent popular documentaries, one about flat earthers that shows you what people who think the earth is flat believe, and that was true for them, but it doesn't seem, am I to say that that's not true? It's unclear. And then my second kind of quick gripe is that at the beginning you said I could tell the difference, or I could know what to expect of a documentary by its introduction. I would like to challenge that on an epistemic level. There are a number of documentaries, or this new popular genre, mockumentaries, where if I don't see any advertising, I could be easily fooled into believing that they're truthful kind of journalistic endeavors. So just to quickly recap, what we're asking you is about the guiding principles that overlook our expectations and how being upset can actually be a better teacher. We're asking you about your method and how, when do we sign a contract with others for art to tell us the truth? We're wondering about whether documentaries and journalism is on the same level, or if they're not, and if so, how are they different? What are the guiding principles there? And about the epistemic challenges of what am I supposed to expect when I'm watching a piece of art that maybe is telling me a version of the truth, but is maybe not an objective truth. And with that, we yield our time.
Okay, good, thank you. So University of Mississippi Ethics Bowl team, you will have 3 minutes to work on developing your response. Your time begins 30 seconds after you're in your respective breakout rooms. So University of Mississippi Ethics Bowl team, you have 5 minutes to present your response. Your time begins now.
Thank you. We'd like to thank the commenting team for raising some interesting questions. And so we're going to proceed by talking a little bit about the learning process and how our principle works there. Then we're going to kind of talk about our principle of truth and what that actually looks like, how that manifests in artistic decisions of filmmaking. And finally, we're going to address the comparison to journalism and try and make a little bit of a distinction of how we see it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jake.
So your concern about guiding principles, like our guiding principles overlooking learning, we think is like a valid concern, but we do think that we do allow for documentaries to still be educational, because we are like completely okay if the actual content of a documentary upsets like the viewer's expectations, but we are not okay if the actual way that a documentary is like edited or the way that a documentary handles the truth does not meet the viewer's expectations. So to bring like an example to this, we are okay if like a National Geographic documentary shows a tiger viciously like mauling and then eating a gazelle on like the on screen, and because that like will definitely be upsetting the expectation of like what you were seeing on just like daytime television. But we are not okay with how like Netflix presented like Tiger King and all of that, because it was presenting what was like in effect Joe Exotic's truth as the truth. And it was also like doing a lot to like frame the narrative in a way so that it was, so that like you were not actually able to like really figure out, unless you did outside research of your own, what the actual truth was, how all of the things related. Like a great example to like, if you just want to do some research on your own, there's a lot of like racial stuff that like Joe Exotic said on the TV that was edited out. And then like the meat grinder that was presented as Carol Baskins is just not at all an accurate comparison to the one that she had. And that like we think that this also like ties into like the second concern that you brought, where like art being truthful, where it's like it doesn't have to be truthful as long as it is upfront and actually like realistic with how it is explaining it. So like within this, like we think that here's like where the meat grinder is, because there was this accusation in Tiger King where Carol Baskin ground up her husband in a meat grinder, and the entire time that she was saying like how ridiculous this was or how untrue it was, they were showing this picture of this big old Sweeney Todd looking like industrial meat grinder there, and not like this tiny little kitchen one that she had. The one that she had would barely be able to like grind up a whole steak, and the one that they presented is something that would be able to make burgers in a factory for McDonald's. So within that, that's like where we see this disconnect between what audience expectations were versus what was actually happening and what was actually true.
Thanks, Jacob. And I think Ryan had a little more to say about that.
I just wanted to touch up on the point that art has no obligation to produce truth. And so, while in most instances I would agree with that claim, I think that by the nature of documentaries being documentaries, where most people, the actual expectation for documentaries is they pursue truth to some degree. I addressed this in my potential objection is that while there are biases in every documentary, the entire point of our argument is to say that the audience should know what those potential biases are going to be. Even if someone's truth might differ from someone else's, the audience expectation should be that, okay, we know that this is an art form, this is a documentary, so we're expecting some type of truth, but we'd like to know to what length is that bias going to affect the truth that we want to hear. And I'll pass it back to JR.
I just wanted to point out something. We're not disagreeing that you can show different truths, or that truth isn't objective. It's just that you can show truth with a perspective. And our primary focus here is that when you're framing a narrative, you have to indicate the reliability of that frame. Just for example, there were a bunch of people that read The Princess Bride, and it has a very interesting narrative structure where there is a fictional framework within a fictional framework, but that author never indicated that the overlapping fictional framework was fictional. And a lot of people think it's the real deal. We don't think that he, as a fictional writer, had any obligation to frame that narrative and indicate its truthfulness. But we do think that documentaries have that obligation because that's part of their style. That's part of what identifies them as documentaries, not as fictional cinematographers, etc.
And finally, we think that as opposed to journalism, documentaries can tell more specific truths rather than just
And that
reporting the
is time.
facts. Thank you.
Okay, so judges, you have 3 minutes to work on developing your hard-hitting questions. After that, we'll come back and grill the team. So your time begins 30 seconds after we all get into our respective rooms. Okay, we're all back. So judges, same as last time. Each judge gets one question and then one follow-up question, and do your best to give them powerful, hard-hitting questions, stopping only short of tears. Or, let's practice before the competition. Let's really sock it to them. Get a tear out of them. Take it away.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. You mentioned veil of ignorance, but there wasn't much of an explanation or an explanation of the social contract and what that's entailing in the case. Can you talk about how the veil of ignorance produces these specific principles? And then I might have a follow-up after that.
So we think that that you're able to come to these specific principles from the veil of ignorance, both as like primarily as a filmmaker or as a like audience member, but also as a like a subject of the documentary. Because like if the truth is not being respected in a way or like treated in a way that the documentary like says it's going to treat it, that's not necessarily something you would want to watch. That's not something you would want to be a part of. That's not something like you would want to have other people making and like have like the same level of like quality or like genre or whatever as like you are producing. So that like as like a producer, it can like if you're not having like these expectations like accurately presented and met, then you're having like the whole like idea of a documentary being degraded. As an audience member, like you're not actually having like a genre of stuff that is actually worth watching. And then as a subject, you're not actually able to like you're not going to want to actually be a part of this thing that like isn't necessarily worth being a part of. I hope that addresses your concern.
Okay, so when I think of veil of ignorance, I usually see it applied to cases where you can kind of see biases and see how you would want to create a society without those, or try to mitigate those. In this situation, the biases don't seem very clear. How are they supposed to take those into the original position? They're not aware of them. Does that make sense?
So we think that like the biases that you were talking about is that like having these expectations for the audiences and the makers and the participants makes it so that you can have the distinction between something like Planet Earth and Keeping Up with the Kardashians, where they are both like documentary in nature, where they're like recording events that like actually happened or actually happened, if it's reality TV. However, it allows for both of them to be like respected for what they are and both be documentaries, and that like it allows for like those like distinctly different like ways of treating editing, truth, and all of that, to both like be respectable by the by everyone. And I think that one of my teammates is going to expand on from there.
Yeah, and so I just want to briefly touch on the original position, right? And when you're forming this contract from original position, not knowing who you might be, whether you could be a viewer or a subject or a filmmaker, we think that without knowing that, previously, you would probably want to allow documentary filmmakers to have some leeway in being able to be creative and differentiate from one another, but you would also want those expectations to be set of the perspective of the truth, whether you are a subject or whether you are a viewer.
And we also think that like there are like certain like financial and monetary biases that these expectations allow to like be addressed appropriately. Because if you're having a documentary that's like produced by Monsanto that's about agriculture, then like if as long as you are well aware of the fact that it's like being produced by Monsanto, then you can actually like get value out of that in a way that you wouldn't be able to otherwise, because the expectations were like presented as what they were like supposed to be and met by the film.
Okay, next judge.
So a couple of observations that may or may not end up being questions, but forgive me for, you invited a guy that just came out of his MFA documentary seminar, so my mind is in this space. You used as kind of your academic foundation Grierson, but you used him improperly. I think you got Grierson confused with Phil Nichols, in your definitions of documentary. But if we're going to go with Grierson defines documentary as, quote, the creative treatment of actuality. It's not about truth. I mean, if we're going to go Colbert, it's about truthiness, right? But the creative treatment of actuality. So I think you've got to be really careful about choosing your experts, but especially if you're going to go with somebody like Grierson, who was kind of the father, the first person to use the word documentary maybe. But I mean, the idea being that there is a kernel of truth. There is an element of truth, but it's all creative. By the time I look at it, imagine it, record it, cut it, edit it, put it on a thing and get it out to you, it is only an amalgamation. It's a piece of truth. So I think you've got to be really careful about your experts that you pick, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump on that grenade because that was definitely my bad. You're right. It was Nichols has those 6 basic forms of documentary. I still think that the explanation of the reflexive mode of documentary was useful for our discussion because it allowed us to address the creative treatment of actuality. That's actually in my notes. I meant to mention that. And I think that we acknowledged that by saying that truth comes with perspective, but then we took a step back and said, well, you need to acknowledge whether or not that's a reliable perspective. And that was our main criticism with the specific documentary series, Tiger King, is that they didn't acknowledge the truthiness of what Joe Exotic says. But I'm foot and mouth on that one. Thank you for pointing it out.
And we also think that, I'm sorry.
Pardon me, go right ahead.
We also think that like as long as you set the audience's expectation for like how the documentary is handling truth is done appropriately, then you're able to actually have like Jersey Shore being appreciated for what it is rather than just like thrown in the bin. Now, whether or not you think it should be thrown in the bin, that's for a different debate.
I I assumed it was just a simple mix-up, but I had to make the observation. And I really do think that I'm not sure y'all are consistent on this idea of truth though, and this idea of what's real and not real. And I think Professor Yinter probably is going to follow up on that a little bit, but I just feel like that you need to have kind of a unified front on what you think is truth. And and then the contract. I mean, I don't know if Ali mentioned it before, but the contract with the viewer that y'all mentioned several times. I'm not really sure that that's clearly defined.
Good. Thank you, Professor Harper.
So in response to the commentary's question of why I think ARC has an obligation to tell the truth, it was responded that documentaries do pursue truth, so that you need to be upfront about biases. And that reinforced something said in the beginning about framing and some of the things upfront that need to happen. So Professor Harper has emphasized calling into question whether in fact documentaries do pursue truth. I want to call into question the entailment that if they do pursue truth, we need to be upfront about biases. I think that's a false principle for at least 3 different reasons. The first one is that it's impossible. The second one is that it's inconsistent with the artistic expression that you've been discussing. And then I'll get to the third one in a moment. So first of all, I think it's impossible to be upfront about one's biases because the nature of biases is such that some of them are implicit, which means that you can't know what the biases are. So one could not be upfront about the biases even if you wanted to be. So you have an ought implies can problem. This is not a reasonable restriction to place on a documentary filmmaker. The second one is that it comes into conflict with the artistic vision. You seem to think that the nature of these things is that they are somehow grounded in the actual world, such that the object of the documentary is to say something about the world. Although you've mentioned multiple kinds of documentaries, you keep coming back to questions dealing with what's coming through is something educational or something informative or something about the world, which is what gives rise to the problem with journalism. However, it's not clear that that's actually the content of many films that are classified as documentaries. In fact, oftentimes the subject of documentaries is the nature of documentaries, or it's the nature of the subjectivity of experience, or it's an essay film, or it's something else that isn't getting at a presentation of historical fact. So because of that, it's not clear that there are these journalistic considerations that need to come into play such that we need to be upfront about the biases. The third issue is this seems like a false principle because it doesn't seem that in general, when we are engaged in truth pursuing activities, we need to be upfront about our biases. I don't think I have a responsibility on the first day of class to say, well, we're doing philosophy, which means we're pursuing truth. Here's all of my biases. I don't think that follows from the nature of truth pursuing activities. And then finally, you keep talking about how the material is presented as if it was somehow up to the filmmakers how it in fact is presented, when in fact many of these decisions are outside of their control. Once they sell the distribution rights, there's issues of the maker versus the producer. There's issues of the distributor, in this case Netflix, and how they are presenting it, and the role that they might have in later on editing and changing the film in various ways. One of the issues facing contemporary documentary filmmakers is the desire by online platforms to spread them out into multiple episodes and how that changes the structure of films. So for all of these reasons, I think you're endorsing a false moral principle.
Thank you. So I'm going to just try and, I guess, respond as general as possible. First of all, I think it's only right that we apologize for the butchering a little bit. But I think, moreover, though, to an extent, maybe in the smallest, barely resembling form, our principle still exists a little bit, that in general, you ought to set the expectations for the viewers, especially as it pertains to things such as marketing, right? And so when you're marketing things, don't market it as entirely truthful. When you're going to have maybe not necessarily biases, but blatant falsehoods, such as the meat grinder example that Jacob talked about, like things like that are first of all, possible to eradicate, and B, like probably professors too would be expected to not like knowingly misrepresent historical philosophers and such as that. And I think Jacob might have an example of the type of biases we're trying to avoid.
So when we say that like we are trying to like set the viewer's expectations for like editing and truth, we don't mean that like before like you watch Tiger King that we want you to watch like a 6-hour documentary on every little like opinion and bias and all that like everyone that was a part of the film was making, because that's just like unreasonable for the viewer if on that regard, and also unreasonable for the actual filmmakers themselves to like need to produce that. But the issue that we want is that if something is claiming to be like the truth, or if something is claiming to be like this is the objective reality of how it is, then like it shouldn't be going off instead and like saying someone's specific truth and someone's specific thing. So that's like the specific issue that we take with Tiger King, is that it says, hey, this is the truth of the situation, when in reality, that's not actually what we see happening. What we see happening is that Joe Exotic's truth is presented. And then like, the example of like National Geographic that we had presented earlier, like that is presented as the truth. And then what you see presented is just nature as it is with no interference from the filmmakers. So like what you actually see is what was like claimed to be presented to you.
Yes. So in the most general sense, set the expectations if you're going to have, just plain film, or if you're going to include editing, make that clear, possibly in marketing, or if you're going to do a mockumentary, include pretty obvious things such as The Office and Parks and Rec do in the first 30 seconds of each episode, so that you know that it's a mockumentary. Hopefully, that at least helps to clarify a little bit how we were approaching this.
I just want to tie in one more little point at the end there. I think it's about intention as well. That if you know what the facts are, and just because you want to make something that people enjoy, if you like blatantly misrepresent the facts in order just to get viewers for it, rather like if you have like the purposeful intent to produce what is true, I think there's like a big distinction there that we didn't clarify earlier that I want to like just reiterate or just to point out right now as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to let this one rest. We've had a lot of comments on it, unless there's space.
We have 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm just going to go for it. Yeah, I'm just going to go for it. So I really liked your point, Dr. Genter, about the subjectivity of truth, and that sometimes documentaries themselves would even highlight the subjectivity of truth. And I think that they have every right to do that, but in the case file presented, like Tiger King, we think that they would have failed if that was even their intention in the first place, by not highlighting, the unreliability of the narrator that they're using as a subject, as the primary subject that they're following. And we think that there's a lot of other extraneous social factors going on that would suggest someone using the same production company, Good and Becca, I think was the last name of the other producer. These people make documentaries about wildlife constantly, where they focus on the wildlife, not on the personalities that other people have. And so we think that if you're following this group of people, if you're following these producers and these documentary filmmakers, you have a reasonable expectation of a certain kind of truth and a certain kind of presentation of documentary that wasn't fulfilled there. So hopefully that addresses a little bit of what you were saying.
Yeah, so the response so far has focused on implicating faults to the filmmaker that strike me as issues with the naivety of the audience, that about the nature of the representation. So up until a little bit of what Weston just said right now, I haven't heard anything about what specifically did the filmmakers do to index this as objective truth, and that this being this kind of documentary. I haven't heard any good reason for that. Except for a little bit now with the narrative perspective coming through here. So without that, I'm left thinking this is a fault of the audience rather than the filmmakers. So can you give me some reason to think that it's actually the filmmaker at fault here for failing in their obligations, as opposed to all the things that you've attributed actually being faults in the audience?
So what filmmakers can actually do a lot to misrepresent what is true and like how things are happening and like who should or should not be believed. The example that I want to go back to is the one that I brought up. I think it was when we were initially presenting our case about Carol Baskin and her meat grinder, where what they were trying to do is present that like, hey, Carol Baskin is lying because she's saying that she just had this little meat grinder, and look at this picture of this like big old industrial meat grinder that we found and that we are editing over her. So that's a way where it's like the actual meat grinder that she had and the one that they presented was not matching up. So that like led you to the belief that like, hey, maybe she's lying about the meat grinder that she had, even though that's not necessarily the case. And like further, Tiger King is presented by Netflix as an informative documentary and like the tags and all of that. And so that it's like it is presented as something that should be objectively true when there are specific things in it where you are being told as like an audience member that like, hey, this person, maybe not necessarily believe them, even if they are like later to be found out telling completely the truth. And even that's something that like is also often known at the time by the makers of Tiger King as to like actually be the truth, even though they didn't represent it as such.
Okay, good. We're out of time for the judges' questions and response. So we'll stop our recording there and we'll give the judges and commenting team a chance to give the team feedback on how to develop their cases more. So I hope you have enjoyed this evening's event. I know the judges enjoyed watching it. The commenting team certainly had a lot of fun in presenting challenges to the students. And one of the benefits of this kind of practice is it helps the University of Mississippi Ethics Bowl team realize where they've got some holes or problems with their argument and places where they need to improve. And I hope that it is similarly instructive for you in watching this, that you not only found it interesting and fun to watch, but also that you felt you learned something of particular concepts or arguments, or why some arguments worked, why some arguments weren't as strong to make. Thank you for joining us on this virtual event of the Great Debate 2020, and we hope to see you for the next one.